Welcome to the Skiffy and Fanty Show's SF at School.
Today's lesson will be don't live in the Renaissance, no matter what you do. If you have a time machine, wrong direction. Go somewhere else.
Okay, I might have to ask about that later. Well, I'm Shaun.
I'm Trish.
And on today's show, we'll be talking to a special guest who you just heard about the European Renaissance, history, and other things. And that person is Ada Palmer. Welcome, Ada, to the show.
Hello. I love the show, so it's really fun to be on.
Holy crap,
great.
You know about this show?
Oh, yeah. I mean, nobody can follow the Hugos and not get pointed at a lot of the best podcasts, including you guys. So,
Yay. Well, for those of you who may not know, welcome to new people on the show. Ada Palmer is, I quote, a cultural and intellectual historian focusing on early modern Europe. Her current research treats censorship and radical heterodoxy, especially the ways censorship evolves during revolutions in information technology, from the print revolution to the digital. An associate professor in the University of Chicago History Department, she works on the histories of science, religion, heresy, free thought, books, and classical reception, especially the Renaissance and Enlightenment. Hopefully you agree with that description, Ada.
Possibly you wrote it.
I think I did.
Yeah.
Okay.
At some point, every academic writes their own bio and then one day realizes it's not accurate, but it's still on the internet.
Well, that could be an old version or something, so I just wanted to check.
No, that one, I saw it earlier, and it's 100% good.
Perfect.
But in addition to being a historian, Shaun...
Well, Ada's also an internationally award-winning science fiction and fantasy novelist, author of the Terra Ignota series, a two-time Hugo Award finalist, I will just note, beginning with Two Like the Lightning, which has, by the way, a really fantastic cover. Those books,
Yes.
you got like the lottery. You won on that.
I know. I was so lucky with the covers of that. And I was so lucky with the cover of my first academic book. So I totally have bad book cover karma coming up. And I'm sure that the cover of my new Norse mythology series is going to be like an artsy photograph of Loki's abs against fire or something abysmal like that. Just to make up for the karma of how good my covers have been so far.
I hope what you get is actually like chunky Thor. You know, like, because I don't know if you remember, Ada, people losing their minds because there was some video game where they had Thor and he had a bit of a, like a beer belly and he was carrying a hammer. And it was very clear, like, he was still strong. He was just, he wasn't like ripped and like looked like he was on steroids. And I always just thought, like, no, that's kind of what he drank a lot of beer. What did you think happened to him?
Right. Well, not just the video game, but in-game part 2. But anyway, before we get into our questions for Ada, a reminder for everyone listening and watching to please share your questions and comments with us at skiffyandfanny.com/listener suggestions. They might get discussed right here on future shows. And of course, if you're here now, feel free to type your questions into the chat. If you aren't here, join us on Twitch for Shaun's Alphabet streams every Friday at 7 p.m. Central to be a part of our interactive live streaming format. Finally, be sure to join our Patreon and be part of our Torture Cinema polls, live watches, newsletters, other special Patreon-only events on Discord. It only takes $1 a month, but it helps.
Perfect. Okay. So, I've got some silly questions that I like to ask because you can interpret them however you like. But given that you are a historian, I figure you'll approach these in a very curious way. And so the big first question is a what question, which is, what is the Renaissance?
Yes, which is not a brief question to answer. And in fact, I have a nonfiction book called Inventing the Renaissance coming out in early next year, 2025, which is actually very much about this set of questions. What is the Renaissance and where did we come up with this idea? Because it's a label we use for a chunk of time. But what chunk of time is incredibly variable because it depends on who you ask and what they're studying or where they're from. And I can go around campus and go to the English department and say, what is the peak of the Renaissance and when does Renaissance begin? And they'll be like, the peak of the Renaissance is when Shakespeare is writing his stuff, so 1600. And then I'll go to the friends next door in the Italian department and say, when is Renaissance? And they'll say 1250. Anything past 1500 is already modern. We use this word for the idea that there is a period of transition between medieval and modern. And then we bicker about when that period of transition begins, when it ends, and what it means. And fundamentally, the word Renaissance is about the word modern. Now, the word modern is one of the worst words in the world and totally needs to be fired, because whenever you use modern, you mean something completely different in different contexts, right? And modern computing is a different moment in time from modern art, which is a different moment in time from modern fashion, which is a different moment in time from modern baseball. And I polled Twitter once and got a range of, in your field, when is modern, ranging from, early 1800s, 1700s, 1600s. Every single decade of the 20th century had a different thing that modern began there. Some people's modern began in 2012. Some people's modern ended in 1900, depending on what people are studying. And then, of course, geologists are like, well, modern begins 300 million years ago when the Earth's crust became different from the other thing. That's modern. You're like, all this word means is whatever we think is the current-ish or possibly recent but slightly over or maybe contemporary-ish phase of whatever we're looking at. Which means that if you're into electronics, this started in like 1985. And if you're into DNA, this started 150 million years ago. So what is modern? It is the era that is the most recent blop of color on your timeline, if you've got a timeline. And of course, everyone's timeline is different because it's a timeline of a different thing. Fundamentally, though, when we're looking at history, a lot of the time, people make a claim that modern is defined by X. And the arrival of X is what transformed the presumably bad, stagnant, bad, superstitious Dark Ages, which of course didn't exist, into whatever we have now. And you get lots of different claims about what X is that made this change happen. And none of those claims is neutral, because all of those claims can serve a particular argument or ideology. And I like to talk about this as they are different suggested X factors. Someone suggests an X factor and says, this is what made the world become modern. One often suggested X factor is banking. That, finance and money lending and insurance and all of the sectors that enable the type of economic growth that defines modern capitalism start to develop between 1250 and 1400. And you then get a transformation in economies and much more import and export of goods. England, instead of processing its wool at home into cheap, itchy wool, exports its wool to Italy, where high-quality olive oil used as an industrial processor for wool can make high-quality, non-itchy wool, which therefore sells much better. And so just like the modern economy, people are making more money and products are getting better, and there is more infrastructure and also movement of people along with movement of goods, and that this creates a dynamism that moves us forward. That is one proposed X factor for what made medieval stop and then a period of transition to get to modern. Notice that this X factor makes the claim that modernity is defined by capitalism. And this particular version of the Renaissance was really popular during the Cold War among people who wanted to say capitalism is modernity, communism is like the bad, nasty Dark Ages. Therefore, the Renaissance being caused by banking proves that we are correct in our thing. So that's one example of an X factor. Another X factor people suggest sometimes is democracy. The claim being made that the cradle of the Renaissance and the first beautiful art that we really admire and the intellectual innovations that we're excited by, like Leonardo and Michelangelo and Machiavelli, prospered in the republics, prospered in Florence, prospered in Venice, and that there was the beginning of something like modern political participation and everyday citizens thinking about wanting to be participants in their republic, and that this was a sort of a cradle of proto-modern democratic thought. That stimulated all the art and innovation and science and discovery, and in turn, ... you get modernity a couple centuries later as a result. Notice how this is a claim about democracy being the defining factor for modernity and a particular idea of political participation and so on. This was popular among people who wanted to justify dismantling the indigenous government systems of places they were colonizing in order to replace them with European democratic systems that they could claim were modern and whatever anyone else was doing backwards. So the word Renaissance can be used a lot in politically useful ways to justify replacing anything with your thing, or your thing being the future and other people's things being the bad, nasty Dark Ages. So it's a very vexed and very fractious and often very harmful idea, and gets used and reused a whole lot in the 19th century when it's justifying its age of imperialism, in the Cold War when each side is trying to justify why they are the inheritor of the Renaissance and the other one is not. And even now when you get political parties that make claims about, we will bring a new golden age of X, they're claiming this narrative that there is such a thing as Dark Ages and Golden Ages. This is nonsense. There is no such thing as a Dark Age or a Golden Age. This was totally invented. And what you have in all of these ages is mixtures of stuff, and some stuff that is good and some stuff that is bad, and lots of stuff that is getting better and some stuff that is getting worse. And people drew a line between medieval and Renaissance, but it's a very artificial line. But it's a really useful line because the idea of a Dark Age and then a Golden Age is really cool. And it's not only useful for claiming things like, when my political party is in power, we will have another golden age, and my political opponents are bringing a dark age upon things. It's also useful in stuff like, if you're coming up with the backstory of your cool fantasy world, having a narrative about how there was a dark age and a dark lord and everything was bad, and then the elves went to Saturn and something else happened, and then there was a golden age, and then the golden age was lost when the elves all melted into a sphere, and then something else happened, right? Golden ages and dark ages are really narratively exciting and narratively satisfying. They're very easy to believe in. And in fact, you get this a lot now with people's way of thinking about the climate crisis. Because people want to imagine that there's going to be this sort of apocalyptic transition to a dark age. And that's a very easy, uncomplicated, simple way to imagine what's going to happen when the climate crisis advances. It is nothing like what's going to happen when the climate crisis advances, but it makes it feel as if you understand the way the climate crisis is going to work. And you can watch movies about the fall of the Roman Empire and feel like you get it and know what it's going to be like. So it's really hard for historians to get rid of these myths of Dark Age and Golden Age because they're so useful and they're so narratively satisfying. And that's one of the reasons it's really neat to work on the Renaissance and say, okay, what was really going on in this phase that we label as a transition? Is it a transition? Is there anything that's actually uniquely, definingly different? And I often characterize it in my trying to describe what's actually different between medieval and Renaissance, using the phrase ever so much more so. So this is from a old comedy story by the same author who wrote Make Way for Ducklings. And in it, this is a folk tale that he makes up, and a traveling salesman comes to town. He has this powder called Ever So Much More So, and if you put it on anything, it exaggerates all of its characteristics. So if you put Ever So Much More So in your coffee, it'll be so much more delicious and rich and luxurious and caffeinated, but that bitter taste the coffee has will also be way, way, way extreme, and then you just can't have it. And one of the characters puts the Ever So Much More So in his bed, and his bed is so comfy and amazing, and he doesn't ever want to get up. But his mattress is slightly squeaky, and it also gets on one of the squeaky springs, and then it's so deafeningly loud that he can't stand to get near the bed. And so Ever So Much More So, it just makes everything that was already going on a bit more extreme, so that the good stuff gets more conspicuously good and the bad stuff gets more conspicuously bad. And that's actually the way I encourage people to understand Renaissance, is that there was a long period of change in which things are happening, new things are being invented and developed and deployed, cities are growing and changing, governments are gradually over the course of the whole Middle Ages centralizing, trying to get more power, kingdoms are getting a little bigger bit by bit. And when you get to 1400-ish, we often want to describe it as if there was a sort of a flat line and then a sudden zig up. But it's actually just a steady diagonal that has gotten to the stage of feeling really conspicuous. And the changes are therefore both bad and good. And I know we have lots of questions, but I'm going to give one example and then let you move on. So one fact that a lot of people find really surprising about the Renaissance is that compared to the Middle Ages, the life expectancy went down, not up in Europe. That the medieval life expectancy, these are broad swath numbers, but the medieval life expectancy generally averaged around 35 in much of Europe. And in the major cities in the Renaissance, like Renaissance Florence, by 1450, it had gone down to 18 as our average life expectancy. Now, people are always like, these numbers are really low. You have to remember to remove child mortality. I'm like, well, we could remove child mortality, but child mortality was true in both of these cases. So whether we include or exclude child mortality, we've still had a drop of average life expectancy by more than 15 years, or almost 15 years, right? Yeah, more than 15 years. Math, not my instant strong suit. So what's going on? And the answer, weirdly, is progress, because technology is advancing. People are using gunpowder more. Guns are bigger. Armies are more organized. States have centralized more. Kings are able to tax their people more efficiently. States have more money. Armies are larger and more effective at destroying towns. Wars, therefore, have more civilian casualties and are just larger in the scale of any individual war. The economy is booming. People are exporting English wool to Florence to get made into high-quality wool. As they go back and forth with this wool, they bring the diseases back and forth. So the diseases are circulating faster. The majority of the increased mortality is actually kids between the age of 5 and 12 who are getting more diseases because the diseases are circulating more because there's more trade and more prosperity and more international movement and all those cool northern European musicians coming down to Italy to get rich and so on. And every time you have an increase in interconnection, diseases move more. So is this a golden age? It is if we judge it by the stuff that's sitting in the museums. Because the stuff that's sitting in the museums looks really cool and is really shiny. And we go see it and we're like, that looks great. Is it a golden age to actually be alive in when you're watching more and more of your kids get sick and the wars become larger and scarier? It isn't. And so I like to summarize this by quoting my very favorite Renaissance document, which is a letter Machiavelli received from a friend. The friend was a mercenary commander, and Machiavelli had just written the first half of a history of that decade, the decade that ended in 1506. And his friend wrote to him and said, Machiavelli, you need to finish and write the second half of your history, because without a good history of this period, future generations will never believe how bad it was. And they will never forgive us for having destroyed and lost so much so quickly. That is the decade that Leonardo painted the Mona Lisa and Michelangelo carved the David. So to us, it looks like a golden age. To them, it felt like an apocalypse. And I find that a very fruitful and useful thing to think about when we think about right now and how much right now feels like an apocalypse, but is also producing all sorts of wondrous things that 100 years from now, people may well look at and think the 2020s were a golden age. Because what you're judged by as your legacy and what it actually feels like on the ground to be alive can be really, really different.
Ooh, that's chilling. I would love to take a time machine to the future to figure out, like, what in my generation is remembered in 100 years. Like, I hope it's just the good stuff, because I don't really want the horrible stuff to be part of my legacy.
Well, but we also hope they remember the horrible stuff and learn from it, which means they're not doing it, right? We have this, our history department's unofficial motto is, quote, "Don't make me repeat myself," signed history.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
And we want that, right? One of the reasons that Machiavelli wrote his histories was to tell people, don't do this. When we did this, it was bad. Don't have a pope who invites the king of France to invade Italy. This is tactically bad. Just don't do it. If you do it, don't do it 3 times.
It won't go well for you.
No, it won't go well for anyone. Not even the king of France.
I mean, you'd think we would have learned that even in our so-called quote-unquote modern times of like how many people have invaded what we think of as Afghanistan, and like how has that gone for all of them every single time? Not great.
Well, and the more we look at history, the more useful it is. I know a historian who works on the area that is now Syria, who's mostly a really ancient person, working back 3000 BC. But when the wars involving ISIS and the Islamic State began, that historian was called in to consult with Department of Defense Intelligence and military people, and was looking at their maps and said, they're going to pull up along this river and make their camp here. And the guys were like, how do you know? And he was like, because every single war that's been fought there the past 8,000 years, people have always pulled up that bit of the river and made their camp right there. And he was totally right. That, some simple geographic realities and practicalities, in fact, we can learn from even over millennia, whereas other things are incredibly contingent and different. And one of the things that history tells us is some things really stay the same. Other things are so different that even 3 or 4 years apart, the situation is going to be unique.
Yeah. You're making me think now of like, Star Wars doesn't necessarily do this terribly great, but like the character of Thrawn in Star Wars is always thought of as this brilliant tactician. And like in the original, he like analyzes the art and culture of every group he's going to invade because he thinks that he can learn something tactically advantageous by being hyper-focused on what makes them who they are. But to some degree, I suppose like what you're describing is maybe more a realistic version, which is like looking at the history of a culture or a geographic region and looking at the common patterns and trying to figure out from that what might repeat and what maybe won't, because as you say, the contingencies might have changed and made that maybe not advantageous, which is cool and also terrifyingly powerful.
Yeah. I mean, another great historian saying is history does not repeat, but it does rhyme. That some of the structures will recur, but the fractal details around them will still be completely unique every time.
Oh, that's interesting. Yeah, I can see that. Yeah. So I think you've answered almost all of my like what, when, where, why questions when you spoke, which I think is great because now I don't have to ask them. Because I like to ask these questions. I asked them of Daniel when he was talking microbiology because I think people don't quite think about the history of how something became, but you described very well the way in which the Renaissance is formed by, to some degree, the narratives we want to tell or the agendas we may set about how we want to tell the narrative of our history.
And the claim that there was a rebirth, which is part of the claim that there are rebirths. I'm working on an essay right now with the intentionally provocative title, All Science Fiction and Fantasy Authors Are Historians. And I don't just mean because tons of science fiction fantasy writers have figured out that history has way weirder, cooler stuff than you would ever make up, and that if you mine history for examples of cool things, you get really great world building. But it's also because a huge part of the craft of history is trying to figure out how the world changes. What types of actions make big changes? How do governments change? How do technologies arrive and change things? How does power operate? And whenever you're writing, specifically in the realms of science fiction and fantasy, the world is a dynamic character and the world is changing. And the events of the book will generally involve high stakes in which the actions that are taken by the characters result in the world being different at the end of the book from the way it was at the beginning. Sometimes the world is saved, sometimes the world is blown up, sometimes the regime is overthrown, sometimes the regime is just reformed, sometimes a new form of magic is discovered. But all of them involve the world changing in a way that often sort of mainstream lit type books don't involve the world changing, right? They're often, here's a person trying to have a meaningful life against the background of the inexorable modern world in which the world does not change, the people change. But in science fiction and fantasy, pretty much always, actions are taken by people that result in the world changing, which means the author is making a claim about what kinds of actions you can take that result in the world changing and how the world changes. And that judgment call is an act of what historians spend a lot of our time doing. Because a lot of the questions a historian wants to answer, I mean, one of it is, how nifty was it when, eyeglasses were invented? Isn't that a cool random trivia thing? And you can have a history of eyeglasses and it'll be badass. Just in the knowledge of things itself is inherently interesting. And I think that human delight as one of the outcomes of research is an important thing for us to acknowledge. Think of how many times you clicked on a random scientific article about giraffes and been like, that's so cool. And delight is the actual outcome of that piece of research. And it doesn't particularly matter whether we needed to know that about giraffes. If a million people click on the link and love it, that's an incredibly useful application of human study and human time, right? But historians also are trying to help people think better about what actions can I take that have good consequences. When we're trying to change our world for the better, what types of actions are likely to actually succeed in that? We have a case history, particularly bad in the 18th and 19th centuries, of people trying to take actions to improve the world that were incredibly destructive instead of incredibly constructive. And people who meant well, destroying rather than creating, or destroying rather than protecting. Historians want to work hard at giving answers to how can we take more responsible action as future builders, to try to make sure that the actions we take, which are trying to make a better world, have a better shot at success. And that involves looking at the question of what types of actions affect the world, how does power work, who has the power to change the world, how do we exercise it? Which means every science fiction and fantasy writer is in fact a historian.
I would argue sometimes so-called historical fiction writers are just fantasists as well, in a very different way. I know, Trish, you have a question that's related to this, so I'll say an anecdote and then I will shut up for a while. But you mentioned earlier, and Trish will figure out the question you're going to ask next, which is, you mentioned like the myth kind of the Dark Ages, and it made me immediately think of the Vikings, the TV show, The Vikings, from the History Channel. And my favorite thing to say about the Vikings is it's really great at making me Google history to figure out which things it's decided to just make up. And so like there's this moment in I think like season 3 or something where they meet Egbert, who's like some king and whatever, right? Wessex or something. And he's like all these Roman things all over the place. And he's like, we've lost all of this history. All these Romans thought all this stuff. And it's like he's like living in the Dark Ages, as it were, because there was this all this lost knowledge of the Romans. And so that made me immediately go, did the English actually forget all of the cool stuff that like the Roman Empire built? And then people going, that sounds like poppycock. And I was like, well, this sucks, because I thought that was kind of a cool story. And now I'm like, but it's not true. They didn't know.
Yeah. So they lost a few very specific technologies, and I think that's a useful way to think about it. I often work hard at trying to get students to understand better what it means for Rome to fall. And the biggest thing it means is that the percentage of goods you're getting from long-distance import-export goes down. You can't get stuff from far away, because the biggest difference between there being a Roman Empire and there not being a Roman Empire is safe roads and no pirates in the Mediterranean. Right? During the Pax Romana, there were no pirates in the Mediterranean. You could safely send things from one end of the Mediterranean to the other and export them and make money. And that is the only time that has ever been true. There are pirates in the Mediterranean now. And you may remember when everyone was laughing about the ship that was stuck in the Suez Canal, but lots of ships got raided by pirates while waiting to go into that canal during that phase. Piracy was a big thing. And so it meant that, let's imagine you're nowhere near Rome, right? You're not seeing the saga, but you're somewhere off in Rome and Britain, right? What you actually perceive happening when the empire falls is that import goods aren't arriving. So if we imagine the modern version, like you go to the grocery store and there's no kiwis and there's no citrus fruit and there's no out of season vegetables.
Yeah.
And, there's only kind of meh pasta because you can't get the really good Barilla pasta made out of the Italian semolina. You can only get the stuff made out of local stuff that's like somehow not quite as good. And you go to a store to get clothing, and there's just a much less variety of colors and much less variety of fabrics, and actually quite a lot of interesting fashions because local people can invent a cool shape for a hat or a sleeve. But if they can't make bright orange or fuchsia, then there's not going to be bright orange and there's not going to be fuchsia. And so the biggest thing is the contraction of the sphere of where your stuff is coming from. So what the Vikings would be aware of not having, or people in England in that period would be aware of not having, was women could not get the comfy, soft sponges that they used as maxi pads, right? The Mediterranean sea sponges. You had to just use a wad of wool, and that is way less comfortable, right? and that just kind of sucks. And you just keep going, right? But it kind of sucks. And you can't get the nice, soft, white wool that takes dye really easily and isn't itchy, even if you don't have large amounts of olive oil to mix it with. You can only get kind of heavy, itchy, kind of brownish wool. So you can no longer make really light and really vivid colors. All your colors are kind of like olive green, not green, and olive blue, not blue, right? And you also notice that you can't get white porcelain. You can only have like local brown clay, or because you can't get the white clay, right? It's not actually porcelain yet, but and they lose the technology for making the high quality Roman bricks. They just can't make bricks the way the Romans did. They don't have the quality of ash. They don't have the quality of lime. And one of the effects of this is you lose the technology when you lose the ability to get the materials necessary to do it. So imagine if you are a blacksmith and you know how to make high quality Roman grade steel. And then you cannot get the materials to make that, right? It requires imported materials to be able to make the very fine quality charcoal that you have to mix into this to turn iron into high quality steel. So you just can't do it. You have a son, you make him memorize the formula, and you're like, someday we're going to get this stuff again. You're going to be able to make steel, but so memorize this, but for now we're just making iron. And he's like, okay. He has a son. He's like, okay, my grandfather used to say you had to memorize the formula to make this thing that we can't make. I've never made it. But someday maybe we'll have this thing, I'm not even quite sure what it is, that we would need to make this thing. And so after a couple generations, you lose the technology, not because nobody cares, but because if you can't get the high quality imported lime to make Roman bricks, and in fact, the only bricks you can make are crappier than just digging up an old Roman building and reusing its old Roman bricks, you're not going to have a brick-making industry because brick-making is less useful than just mining old bricks. So Britain spends 1,000 years using the same bricks and reduce, reuse, recycle. The same Roman bricks just get reprocessed and reprocessed and reprocessed to build new things because no brick that they can make locally is going to be as good as Roman bricks. And meanwhile, steel, Northern Europe loses steel for a while, except they still have instances of steel, right? And so you read something like Beowulf, and here is our Viking-esque hero going around. He goes to the cave, and there's this amazing sword that's sharper than any other sword, and it's magic, and obviously dwarves made it. And the answer is no, it's just actual steel that is still there because the Romans left stuff, and their stuff is better than your stuff because it's made out of the whole of the European and Mediterranean economy's ability to import goods instead of local import goods. And so this whole idea of having a +1 sword, and people are always like, what's +1 about the sword? The answer is it's steel, my friend, instead of iron. So it's sharper and it's better and it's lighter. And how do you get them? You get them from mysterious, distant elf people, i.e. the Middle East, where they still had steel. Or you get them from ancient, dwarven ruins, i.e. the Romans, who left steel stuff lying around. So legends of a magic sword are the result of the Roman Empire. But that's what's changed. It's not as if every day you're suddenly covered in mud when you weren't before. You're wearing a slightly more dingy color, and your coat is a little bit heavier and less comfortable. And when it's that time of the month, it kind of sucks because you can't get a comfortable menstrual sponge. But other than that, it doesn't make a huge difference to you, except that your political world has also contracted so that the local political actors, who are the ruler of a town or a village, are much more significant in making the biggest decisions that affect your life, taxation, etc. And nobody is defending the roads and nobody is keeping the pirates out of the seas.
It's messy and complicated. Okay, Trish, I am now going to not ask questions for a minute because I have taken up so much time. Trish, you're up. It's up to you.
All right. Well,
answers, I know. Sorry.
Ada, you've already touched on a bunch of the questions that I was going to ask you. So, let me see how to pivot. Just thinking about losing technology like that, eventually people are going to start saying, that never happened. That's just a story. So I was thinking about figuring out historical facts. Modern historians may have more perspective and more access to resources online, but now AI results are messing up online searches. Historians are probably going to have to lean more heavily on primary sources. But speaking of primary sources, I was reading a thread recently between some historians on Blue Sky talking about how their students are swallowing primary sources down hook, line, and sinker and believing, well, this is what happened, without even considering that the primary source writers themselves are biased. So how do we know what's real and what really happened?
So the humble answer is we don't. Like any scientific study, right, what we're getting at is ever better theories that ever better describe the data, but none of them perfectly describes the data, and we're always ready for them to be displaced and replaced with new discoveries and better data. And just as, in 100 years, the Big Bang Theory will have been replaced by the better than the Big Bang Theory, which is going to be 80% the same as the Big Bang Theory, but 20% better in ways that we don't know yet, right? All of our models of what happened are similarly constantly being improved and replaced. And one of the things that's most harmful in history is when people get wedded to the idea that X was definitely what happened. And people get all angry. You're rewriting history. And we're like, yes, that's my job. I'm a historian. You hired me to rewrite the history and give you better history. That's what this department is for. And they're like, I thought this department was for celebrating our heroic thing, not discovering that, in fact, it was actually a marmot. And then we were like, nope. I don't have a marmot example, but I do have a walrus example. There's this great bit in Beowulf where he goes to the pond outside Grendel's mother's. After he's defeated Grendel, he's going to go face Grendel's mother, and there's this big sea demon with big tusks, and he fights it in the thing, and it's very just exciting and dramatic, and Tolkien translates it in a very way that makes it sound very Dungeons & Dragons-y, but if you actually read carefully, it's very clearly a walrus. So what we're actually envisioning is a Viking wet in a pond wrestling a walrus, which is very dangerous, but much less picturesque than the beautiful aquatic demons that we enjoy in our illustrated versions of Beowulf. So every so often, a no fun historian will come along and point out that your awesome sea demon is in fact a walrus, and you're entitled to mope when this happens. But we're constantly observing new things, realizing that our study that we did before wasn't as good as the study we can do now, and getting better. So, for example, during COVID, I and many other people who work on late medieval and on Renaissance got lots of journalists contacting us saying, if the Black Death caused the Renaissance, is COVID going to cause an economic boom? Aren't there these studies that say that after the Black Death, because there was labor shortage, wages went up? And the answer is yes, there are studies that say that after the Black Death, there was a labor shortage, wages went up. Those studies were done in the 1920s in 2 towns in England, and wages went up in those 2 towns, and they were totally right. We've now done 7,000 more studies in all other bits of Europe, and we have more data now. And it turned out that, in fact, that was particular to those places, and in some places wages went up, in other places wages went down. It depended on which industries boomed and which industries busted. We were all familiar how in COVID, the board game industry and the home repair industry boomed and the restaurants busted, right? That pandemics are complex. And more specifically, that the more we look at different places, the more we learned that whether the effect of the Black Death on labor was empowerment or disempowerment was entirely local policy. And that in some places, this was a moment when the disruption of social structure meant that people who had been under the thumb of elites were able to exercise their own power and become much wealthier. In other situations, elites got together, passed some of the very first really disenfranchising, really deliberating labor laws, a lot of the first debtors' prisons, and stripping away of the liberty of labor to actually move from place to place were passed in the wake of the Black Death. So, the takeaway is actually policy is everything, which isn't what people want, right? People want to hear, all we have to do is sit back, relax, and we'll have a golden age. Not actually policy is everything, and every decision you make matters, people. That's a very stressful answer, being told that every decision you make matters. But it's also an empowering answer. And one of the things that I like about zooming in on history and that I focus on in teaching is that the vast majority of events are shaped by a large number of people's small decisions. And the more you zoom in, the more you realize that it's not a few big mover and shaker hero protagonists who shaped what happened. It's 50 different people, each of whom made one choice that combined to have the effect that it had. And I think that that's an important lesson and an empowering one that we really need to hear.
I have lots more I want to ask you about, but first a couple of questions from the audience. The Rising Tides, Brandon O'Brien, wants to know, have you ever given similar thought to what myths will be told about us by future generations similarly removed in time from, say, Beowulf or whatever?
Yes, and there's one of my favorite moments in, is it the third Tarek Noda book? Might be the fourth one. There's a point at which we just hear the narrator mention kind of offhand that in the 25th century, historians argue about whether the First World War ended in 1945 or 1989.
Oh my. Right, sure.
And you hear that, and your brain slots it together, and you realize what it means. But how future people are going to draw their lines and what they're going to consider to be one war or two wars or one era or two eras is not going to be where we do. Just as people living in the middle of the Wars of the Roses sure thought that each of those individual wars was a separate war, right? They didn't think of this as one thing. The 100 Years' War, similarly, from the perspective of someone in the middle of it, these are all very, very separate wars. From our perspective, it's one big war. And it's important, I think, to remember that that will be the case in the future. So, I think we have to think of, when you zoom out, that the transition that is the course of the 20th century as industrialization turns into industrialization of warfare, and then the arrival of nuclear technologies, these are going to be looked at as part of one phenomenon, not many different phenomena. And the odds of them thinking of the Cold War as a separate thing from World War I is pretty much nil, even though to us they're incredibly different. Now, someone who's a historian of our time period will think of these as different, right? Just as, since I specialize in Italy 1500, I know the difference between the War of the League of Cambrai and the French invasion of 1494 and the French invasion of 1502, right? And these different things that only people who actually work on this will need to know. But that will be the degree of expertise someone would have to care about the difference between World War I and World War II. For all of it, this is the period in which humanity's technology grew such that humanity was able to destroy enormous parts of itself and the planet rapidly and realized it and had to learn to manage that. And everything from, in fact, possibly the machine gun implementation in the American Civil War with things like Pickett's Charge through the climate disaster are probably going to be seen as one thing. That is the transition from we live on a planet, it is powerful, we are small, we have the ability to hurt each other on a small scale, to, oh, actually, we have technologies so big they can destroy us and the planet on a large scale, and learning to cope with that, and that'll be one chunk and the defining characteristic of this age in a lot of ways.
I find myself doing, to some degree, some of what you're describing and like trying to make sense of the history by explaining to my students like the, you know, late 70s and through like the 1980s of like the Cold War and like how nuclear terror was like this big thing, and like reminding them that, oh, by the way, like the doomsday clock exists as a conceptual thing to explain, and like it still is a problem now. It's just they've added new things on top of it, not just nukes. And I think they have this very weird sense like, oh, it's over. Like, we're not really worried about nuclear war anymore. And I'm like, but if you think about just how terrified people were, like you explained to them, like I mean, we would do like what you would do with an earthquake drill. You would do for like a nuclear bomb was going to land on your, even though that's not going to do anything. You're not going to be safe. Yeah. I love this story.
Talk about your myths.
Yeah, the myths. Well,
it is hard for people who didn't live through it to understand it without having studied it in great detail. And I think an interesting characteristic that you notice in a lot of films or books or stories about these technological changes, up to and including the Oppenheimer film, is that there's about a 200-ish year period during which, at different moments with the implementation of a different specific technology, different groups of people realized that we can destroy everything. Right? And, you see this at different moments. You see this with studies of the First World War poets when they see what's happened to no man's land. They're like, oh, our species is now capable of destroying everything. You see this when we talk with the nuclear physicists at the moment that they realize what this can do. Oh, our species is now capable of destroying everything. This is also the account of the early environmentalists who are first noticing that whole ecosystems are being wiped out or that extinctions are happening, and that, oh, we're capable of destroying everything. That there were these pepperings of people realizing it. And the Cold War nuclear fear was a moment when most of the globe at once realized and understood it. But every individual still had to come to that realization, right? And every kid who's born in the Cold War and grows up enough to understand what it is has to be taught, by the way, we can destroy everything, here's the threat. And it's an interesting tension within the way we're handling the climate crisis right now, that every individual group of people needs to personally learn that humanity is capable of destroying everything and we need to handle it responsibly. And the fact that there was a phase when almost everyone knew that doesn't mean we still have almost everyone know that. And I think a lot of the people who lived in the Cold War for much of their lives and had that fear and then had that fear go away are extra resistant to allowing that fear to come back. Because we fixed the thing where we could destroy everything. It's not a threat anymore. We should be okay now. We worked hard. We handled it. No one thought we could. We won. And the fact that there's a new threat where we can destroy everything is very emotionally challenging when a big part of your lived experience is the catharsis of we faced that and then the world wasn't going to end and we were okay.
I wonder if I know Deepa Chakrabarty talks about this a little bit, where he posits that maybe part of the resistance to like climate change in particular is that, unlike the nuclear bomb or like Hannibal at the gates, the threat is not tomorrow or today, right? It's a threat that takes time. It's going to take decades or a century or centuries for the full impacts, and so we can kind of resist the idea of being worried about it because there isn't the enemy at the gate ready to invade us.
But also, it is happening today, but the enemy isn't at the gate. The enemy is off screen.
Yeah.
And so you go to the grocery store and certain vegetables are incredibly expensive. And you can no longer get X thing, just like, in fact, with the fall of the Roman Empire.
Yeah.
And, more people whose houses have been destroyed by storms recently. And, these bad power outages are happening. And those all are the climate crisis. but they each are a unique thing, so they don't necessarily feel like the climate crisis if they aren't labeled and called out as the climate crisis. And so just as if you're living in the French wars of religion, it feels like every unique thing that is going on is a unique, that one time that one thing happened. You have to zoom out to piece it together. Like, a lot of the climate change is already affecting, our electric bills, our friends, our vacation plans, our shopping, our expenses, our young people who are graduating from college's ability to go pursue careers. And all of us know people who are actual climate refugees because they were in one or another place where sea level rise meant that house is flooding and they can no longer afford to live in it. And we always talk about it as if it's specific to that house and bad luck, but that's the same thing, right? We're in the moment when we're not naming the things that are the big thing as part of the big thing very much. And so it's easy to think, oh, the climate crisis isn't here yet.
It'd be nice if, like, nature showed up and just said, "It's me. I'm responsible,
right.
And you started this. It's your fault."
Yes, if tomorrow all the trees were suddenly orange as a protest to explain that, by the way, you've crossed this percentage of a degree of Celsius, and now we shall forever be orange. Take that. It would make it much easier, because what it is innumerable tiny changes that are hard to connect to each other, in just the same way that somebody in Rome and Britain who can't make good bricks isn't necessarily going to think that this is the same thing that also means they can't get comfortable maxi pads. It's a different problem, but it's the same cause. And the fact that their cousin was killed by pirates in a raid is also the same cause, but sure doesn't feel like the same cause. And that's a big part of why we really need to look at history in order to be able to tell ourselves, hey guys, zoom out. The lived experience of every human being is to see the trees and not the forest. And the historian's job is not just to show the forest, but to also zoom back in again. Because when all you're seeing is forest, then what you have is these tidy narratives. Roman Empire, it falls. Then there's Dark Ages or bad Middle Ages, etc. Then Renaissance, right? That's the forest only. You need to zoom in enough to see the maxi pads and the annoyed brickmaker and the frustrated grandson of this blacksmith who doesn't know why grandpa wants him to memorize this stupid formula. Those are the trees, which is why I say this fractal nature of history, right? The more we zoom in, the more amazing the human details are. And it's when we get to that level that we recognize ourselves. Because when all you see is the big sweeps, it makes history feel like giant gears that are grinding on. And Charlie Chaplin's trapped in the giant machine of modern times, right? But when you zoom in, you realize actually there's no machine. All there is a bucket brigade of people handing a thing to the next person, right? There is no machine. Every single thing that happens is just us doing stuff. It's all made of people. Progress isn't a machine. It's just a whole lot of people, bucket brigade, handing something to somebody else. And it's easy to forget that and to think, oh, we're all trapped within a system. There is no system and there's no trapped. We're within innumerable people around us interacting, handing each other things.
Well, let me encourage you to take a sip of water or whatever while I ask the next question. Daniel Bacteria Lover asks, will there be documents for the future for historians to do the equivalent for us as we do for the past who left physical written records? Because, of course, as you know, much human interaction and correspondence now is done electronically, and people have been told, throw away your books, your physical books, throw away your CDs. We don't need those anymore. We're, of course, seeing things disappear, streaming things disappear. You can't really rely on that, but, it seems to some people as though, a couple hundred years from now, there's going to be a tremendous hole of 20th and 21st century stuff that's just unavailable to later historians.
Yeah.
So how are they going to deal with that?
You know, the one context in which historians often do still use the word Dark Age is to refer to a era when all the sources are missing. An era when we don't have the texts. You know, and when people talk about there being a Dark Age, they're often talking about a patch in European history when there are very, very few texts. And so you have to use other sources that are not texts. So the real answer is yes, we're losing tons of digital stuff. And we're also aware of this. People are racing to archive things. A percentage of our digital material is going to survive. And that percentage is not going to be random. That percentage is going to be very strongly shaped by who happens to have successfully done the curation, who has archived stuff, who has bothered to do this, who hasn't, etc. Right? You know, my dad once downloaded and wrote all of Wikipedia to a CD-ROM. And if that CD-ROM survives, then that exact instance of Wikipedia in that exact moment might have a disproportionately enormous impact, right, on what we know later on, in exactly the same way that the particular things people were wearing when the Vesuvius eruption happened at Pompeii meant that those were preserved forever, have a disproportionate effect on our understanding of what Romans did and had at the time, right? Historians are very good at working with not having any sources, right? I have a friend who's a Hittitologist. That is the ultimate in working with nothing, right? Because the Hittites are the neighbors of the Egyptians and the Persians and the Greeks who didn't have any stuff and were dirt poor, and all they had was rocks and horses. And they didn't write stuff down. They had one library. I love the Hittite libraries. This is the badassest library in the world because they didn't write down their own language, but they got enslaved literate people from Egypt to write down for them using Egyptian characters and so on. An archive of vows that political leaders had made to mountain gods, so that when there was a plague or a flood or something, they could look through the archive and figure out which mountain god they'd forgotten to sacrifice things to, and figure out which one was pissed off so they could go placate that one. This is our only textual record for this entire civilization. It's just a list of who made promises to mountain gods.
Wow.
So we got that. We got some metallurgy, and we've got the Egyptians writing letters about how weird these Hittites are. And that's like all we have, right? But nonetheless, patiently, you know, the list of promises tell us what goods they have to promise. It tells us things about language, tells us things about gender. We can construct, we can work it out. And so we have histories of the Hittites. If we had more stuff, we'd have better histories of the Hittites, but we still have histories of the Hittites, right? A historian will make do with what's there. And so we will have good histories of this period, but they will be distorted by the disproportion of what survives, because what survives is going to be strongly affected by what gets archived how. And so the moment it's going to be similar to is the moment that happened between 400 and 600 AD in Europe. That's actually one of the most significant acts of unintended censorship that has ever happened, because ancient Mediterranean up through Roman Empire, the substance you write on is papyrus. Papyrus is cheap, plant-based, low labor. You can have lots and lots of bureaucracy, lots of documents, lots of libraries on cheap, excellent papyrus. When the empire falls, Northern and Central Europe can no longer get papyrus. Even Italy struggles to get papyrus. So the new writing material is animal skin. And animal skin is way more expensive. You have to raise a whole sheep, and then you have to do a whole lot of labor to the sheep skin, and you have to use it for that and not for a coat or a bag. And so a book on animal skin costs as much as a house, as opposed to a book on papyrus, which cost, you know, what you might earn in a month, or at maximum, right? But not a ton. And so there's a phase during which the papyri are falling apart, because papyrus is brittle and has a lifespan of about 400-ish years before a papyrus will fall apart. The ancient world solution was copy it over onto new papyrus, no problem. But when the papyri are falling apart, you don't have papyrus. And every book you copy over costs as much as a house. They could not save all the text. There was not enough sheep in Europe to make enough vellum to save all the books. It just wasn't possible. They had to choose. And so they chose. And because most of the copying of our books was being done in monasteries, because Saint Benedict, who unintentionally saved practically all of classical literature, wrote in his rules for monks that a monk must read at least one new book every year, which meant every monastery had to have one book per year they expected a monk to live, averaging out to about 70. And they had to be unique books. And that is a lot of money. But they were faithful to St. Benedict, and so they put together scriptoria, and no matter how difficult and expensive it was, they worked hard to have enough books to meet that rule. And they were desperate enough to have those books that they copied over all sorts of even secular material. And practically all of our surviving Greek and Roman stuff, even the naughty bits, we have because it was copied over by monks, because St. Benedict said you need to read a new book every year. But they were picking and choosing, and they were picking and choosing based on what monks like. And this is why we have more surviving books by St. Augustine than all of classical Latin. Because if you trust the task to just one demographic, that demographic's interest is going to just be one thing. So if you imagine that the people who end up archiving our digital stuff are also all major sci-fi geeks, we could end up with a version of our history in which people think sci-fi is like all of 20th century culture or 21st century culture, because it will be disproportionately represented, right? If it's all archived by people who are big into romance novels, you could have, this could be called the century of romance, depending on what are the interests of the tiny minority of people who are the ones who make the archive that ends up surviving. So we're not going to get silence. What we're going to get is weird inflation of the importance of some random set of stuff, because those are the interests of the people whose archive is the archive that becomes the usable surviving one.
You could see this easily, like, if things get kind of bad later, not like super bad, but like what they say the Dark Ages were like, right? Where it's not really as bad as they say, but like, it's fine. But if the narrative, the myth of the 20th and early 21st century is what science fiction tells us in its optimistic form of what we get, oh, it will seem so bad. We don't have our rocket ships, and like there are like robot servants everywhere, and like we're not flying in space, and like, it's not the Jetsons, right? Where you just like fly your little spaceship. But
also we have all sorts of cyber stuff, and they'll be like, their cities were really cool looking and had lots of neon lights in all different languages all over them. We'll be
Where are the neon lights? We can't get that anymore because we can't ship it in.
Yes. Yep.
Yeah, that'd be really fun. Yeah.
Well, I'm going to have a craft question, and I'm going to ask you about your upcoming work, but first I have one more question from chat, from Configuration Queen, who says that at Penguicon several years ago, you, Ada, talked about running simulated papal elections with your students to teach them about how private agendas affect diplomatic negotiations and hence what happens in the world. Is that still a thing you do, or anything similar?
Yeah. I still do that every year. I discuss it quite a bit actually in the Inventing the Renaissance book, because after doing it more than 10 times, it's really interesting to cross-compare and see patterns. But I run it every year. We get a bunch of students. The class has been bigger every year. It's about 60 people now, and each of them is a unique person involved in this political crisis that happened in 1492, and they each have unique goals and resources, and they get a 30-page character sheet explaining their personality and background and goals and how much they loved their sister and how angry they were when their uncle was brutally murdered in the conspiracy, and they'll never forgive that guy for it. And then they have to go negotiate, form factions, elect popes, and then they elect a pope. The pope makes some policy decisions. Then they fight a war. And then at the end, we see who lived and who died, and which cities fell and which cities endured, and which polities became more or less powerful. And it's an amazing experience. And one of the things that's really neat is that it really shows that enmeshed power structures are real, but a lot of liberty of individual action is also real. So, for example, in the in the race to become Pope, there are always two candidates who are the same, because they are the people who have the big enmeshed power structures. And they have the right, networks, and they have the right family connections, and they have the right money connections, and nothing can stop them from being frontrunners. Think about how in the Democratic primary in which Obama was the ultimate candidate, nothing could stop Hillary from being a big candidate and being a finalist in that race, right? But there's also always a wild card papal finalist who usually has never been one of the finalists before, but is a really charismatic person and gets together with all the people who hate the main two candidates, and a coalition will form, and it'll always have the same members, but a different person will be the one they're actually trying to make be Pope, depending on those exact people, their particular persuasiveness, their particular focus, their particular strategies in compromising, what promises they make early on, what friends they make. And when we get our final rundown between the three candidates, it's really every year we're in suspense as to which one is going to win. And it's always the same two, and then one that's completely different, but with the same power structures behind it. And then one of these three will become Pope, and then the wars will begin, and some of the things about the wars will be the same. The King of France wants Naples. Nothing can stop this. Spain hates France. Nothing can stop this. England hates France. Nothing can stop that. A few of the structures are always the same, but others will be really different, because some swing candidate will have been persuaded to support faction A instead of faction B, and therefore will be allied with France one year, but an enemy of France the next year, which will then mean the armies go around and other things. And it means that there's an enormously fractal, unique outcome for the war every year, even though the motives and goals of the war every year are the same. And a lot of people in the war phase, their goal is to protect their homeland from being conquered or overrun. And every year, the ones that work hard at it and really work at it, they'll manage it. Usually by throwing some neighboring city under the bus so that they get crushed instead. But they'll manage it. And I started describing it that it's as if in 1492, 1494, there's going to be this devastating war. Nothing can stop that. The dam is going to break. The momentum is built up. The incentives are there. Nothing is going to make peace. There's going to be a war. The dam is going to break. But everybody has the opportunity to dig channels and try to prevent that floodwater around their place to somewhere else. And when people do that well and plan and mitigate and work at it, they succeed. And they protect what they're really trying to protect 80% of the time. If they work hard and they really try and they don't give up. If they give up, if they try, they succeed. And that metaphor, the dam, nothing can stop the dam breaking, but every channel we dig matters. I then went home and reread Machiavelli. That is what he describes it as in the last chapter of The Prince. He's describing exactly the same war, and I'd forgotten that he arrived at the same metaphor. But that, he describes it as this war is a flood that was going to break upon Italy, and people who did not prepare for the flood were overrun, and people who had dug their channels weren't. And I think that's a really useful lesson to then think about. Nothing is going to stop there being a climate crisis. But every channel we dig matters, and we can protect stuff, and we are protecting stuff. The only situation in which we don't protect stuff is if we give up and don't dig the channels.
Something I noticed in common between your Terra Ignota series and Kim Stanley Robinson's Mars series, and someone else, CQ, pointed out there's an element in common with Katie Martine's Teshkalan series. Readers of later books find out that what they thought was truly happening in the first book turn out to have been fed some misinformation and manipulation by those who were in power. For instance, in the Mars trilogy, things start going badly from the start. In Red Mars, there's just so much interpersonal conflict, and it turns out later that the corporations staffing the mission deliberately chose just a rotten, incompetent psychiatrist and that ended up sabotaging the unity that could have been had between the scientists and environmentalists on the mission team, and so the corporations were able to exploit Mars just as much as they wanted to. I don't want to spoil what happens exactly with Terra Ignota, but let me just discreetly say people in, I think, that was it the second or third book, find out, some of the main characters in that, find out that this super stable government structure was actually partly stable because those in power had been secretly doing things that silenced dissenters. So, as a craft question, later revelations can be shocks to the readers along with the characters, but how much of a risk is there of losing readers, or readers who just don't see some of these revelations despite what may be in the text, if they bounce off the first book or if they miss crucial reinterpretations later? Is that a risk you worry about, or how do you deal with that?
It is a risk. I think it's less of a risk with the, X seems to be true, aha, it was propaganda, which pretty much people always roll with. My model for this is Gene Wolfe, who, of course, is always doing tricks where we don't understand what's going on, or the versions we're getting are distorted. And, having read Book of the New Sun much too young, my standards for how unreliable a narrator should be are through the roof. My rule is always my narrators will be more reliable than Severian, which is like saying my house will be lower than Mount Everest. But nonetheless, I think readers roll with that well, and unless what you've done is made the first book boring, so that there's not enough to be interesting, that having A seem to be true and then Y be true, is fine so long as you've set it up well and it makes sense and it doesn't feel like a cheap trick. The arena in which it's harder with readers is when you're doing something that's a slow burn toward the world and characters realizing the badness of an axis of oppression.
Uh-huh.
So, for example, in Terra Ignota, this is a future that thinks it's doing really well on gender equality and gender inclusivity and is not. And there's a slow burn of it realizing this and figuring out the problems that it's having, and the problems that it's having with handling gender badly causing huge problems, and then it realizing and putting together the infrastructure to handle that better. And I know that there have been readers that have been lost in book one because they see a world where here's a future and gender is not handled well, and they think, oh, this author is bad on gender, and I disagree with them about how gender should be, and they're presenting this world where gender is bad, and I don't like that. Not perceiving that, yes, this is a problem that is being set up to happen later.
Right.
Which means the interesting challenge is how one communicates allyship when you're trying to portray characters who don't get it, and the challenge is getting them to get it, right? How do you get across to the reader, yes, the characters have this, thing where their world is doing gender badly. That is something that the book is going to be about and addressing and moving towards something better. How you signal that is very tricky. And a reader reading a scene where characters are being bad on something like gender, and this applies to all different kinds of axes of oppression, so also social class, also labor, wealth inequality, race, many different things. It can be tricky, and I think it's an extra tricky thing for first published novel, because your first published novel, all of your beta readers while you were developing the book are your friends.
Mm.
And they are going to read the book with presumption of goodwill.
Uh-huh.
And so they can't tell you, can this accidentally be misinterpreted as endorsing this noxious position? Because they know that you don't endorse this noxious position, and they're never going to think that you endorse this noxious position. Someone who's more advanced in their career has more chance, while the book is developing, to have beta readers who don't particularly know you as a person, who could read the thing and say, hey, this gender thing is weird, and I felt like you were being hostile. I was like, oh, no, I was trying to present the character, having a healthy relationship with gender that we're going to address. Here, let's tweak it, and so on. So I think it's an interesting and important writing advice thing for everyone who's about to get their first novel published or is working on a novel that is the first time, to make sure to get a couple of beta readers who don't know you and won't presume goodwill, just to test. Because there will sometimes be things where, this is an issue. You carefully have a bunch of people read for it and they all say it's fine. Uh-huh. And the reason they all say it's fine is that it's on a hairline edge of the characters are doing a complex thing, and the reader has to guess what the author feels and whether the author agrees with the character. And when the beta readers know you, they're not giving you a test the way a reader who doesn't know you when having to guess, is this sentiment the character or the author, will guess differently. So that's an interesting, that I think is much more likely to lose readers than any of X seems to be true. No, Y is true. People are just usually excited about that. So long as it's reasonable. I mean, it's if you do here's our deep vampire fiction. Book 2, actually all the vampires were fake, and now we're just going to have great expectations for the rest of the book, and there are no vampires. Sorry. I think a lot of people would be very upset with that, unless you did it really brilliantly. But but when it's, the secret behind the other thing was this other secret, people are happy with it.
Okay, cool. Well, I guess we should start wrapping things up, but I did want to mention, for those who do not know, in addition to being a historian and a novelist, Ada is also a talented poet-musician. I love your song cycle, Sundown, Whispers of Ragnarok. I have listened to it many times. We'll give Ada's website and stuff like that later so people can look that up. But I wanted to ask, do the conflicting points of views and stories and everything that portrayed in that, do those come into play in your upcoming Viking novels, or can you just tell us more about that?
I'm almost done with the first of 2. It's going to be a duology, Norse myth focused books, and they do connect very much with the music to the degree that the lyrics to Hearthfire are the opening pages of the first book.
Cool.
We're still playing around with the title. The working title is in fact Hearthfire, but the songs wanted to tell a bunch of traditional stories in a fun way, and they tell the stories and they introduce you to the world on a 202 level. Like, they're more sophisticated than a kid's book, but barely, and they're giving fun versions of the tales. The novels are digging super deep into a lot of the nitty gritty of the metaphysics and the way the magic works, and the latest research in a field that has actually changed tons in the past 40 years. There have been tons and tons of major updates in our understanding of how the Norse cosmos works, because, long story short, the toxicity of white supremacist Nazi co-option of Norse studies basically shut the field down for decades in the middle of the 20th century, with the exception of the most careful, we're going to measure this grave, and now we're going to measure this artifact, and so on, because it took a whole generation to get distance from the fact that the major authority in the field of Viking metaphysics, who did his dissertation on this, so you couldn't study it without citing, was the head of the Nazi Ministry of Culture. And you just don't want to cite the head of the Nazi Ministry of Culture, right? So there have been huge leaps in neat fundamentals of our understanding of Viking metaphysics. And I'll give you the concrete example of, did you know Heimdall is actually the trunk of the world tree? We didn't either until fairly recently. But there was a word we were interpreting incorrectly in Voluspa. So there's this word which means Ividya. The word is Ividya. And we used to struggle to figure out whether it meant giantess or whether it meant tree root. And so you got versions of this verse which say, I remember 9 giantesses, or I remember 9 roots, because it's talking about Yggdrasil. We realized, it's both. The tree roots are giantesses. And that Yggdrasil has 9 roots, which are giantesses and are the 9 mothers of Heimdall. And Heimdall is the trunk of the tree. Because when you are in Northern Europe, the tree is not the trunk. The tree is the root system. Think of how often a tree gets knocked down by a storm. Or you might cut the trunk off to go build something out of it, and it grows up again from the base. The practice of pollarding a tree and deliberately cutting it back so that it grows long staves to use to make arrows and spears. The tree is the root system. And the trunk, Draugr, which also means spirit or soul, and is a very masculine word, is Heimdall. So Heimdall is the Draugr, the son of, the body of the tree. The tree is the root system. And we figured this out through linguistics, and it makes a whole lot of sense of things like why it's Heimdall that teaches rune magic to humanity, because the runes come from the tree. Why it's Heimdall who is the watchman. Why it's Heimdall who kills Loki at Ragnarok, because this is the tree avenging itself upon Loki being responsible for, like, it all clicks together. we just needed to figure out this one word, right? So a lot of this stuff is really cool, really new, and just isn't in our Norse fiction because it's all only available in the $300 a volume Oxford University Press annotated 3-volume Poetic Edda, which even I wouldn't own if not that I did a whole lot of favors for Oxford University Press. They gave me $1,500 book in return because I didn't get this stuff, right? And I wanted to write a story that used all of these stories and characters that I grew up on and loved, but that used the new stuff that just makes them way more badass than we ever knew they were. And so that's what I mean when I say there's a lot of technical stuff, but the technical stuff is stuff like Heimdall being the world tree. And the stories are looking at the Viking cosmos and what it really means to be in the metaphysics of Norse paganism, not others. Because one of our big problems in understanding Norse stuff is that when 19th century people started studying it, they assumed that what this was the same metaphysics as Greco-Roman paganism, just with different characters, right? And you have a different name for your thunder god and a different name for your love goddess and a different name for your trickster, but fundamentally the world works the same way. No, the world doesn't work at all the same way. Fate doesn't work at all the same way. Time doesn't work at all the same way. And the meanings of different figures, the idea of Freya as a love goddess, for example, which is just people trying to fill that 19th century people trying to assume there has to be a Venus figure. It must be this. Got into the Norse myth books that educated the people who wrote the Norse myth books that we grew up on. And so they all presumed that the metaphysics was a lot closer to Homeric metaphysics. And Homeric metaphysics is cool. But the Norse metaphysics is really different. And how time works and how justice works and how reproduction works and how much of reproduction is hermaphroditic self-fertilization, it's just really different. The cultures are different. And so what I'm trying to write is something which is showing us these familiar characters in their native environment, instead of in what we didn't realize was Homer's world with alien characters moved into it. So if I have to describe something like the plot, the question of the book is, if the Norse gods are real, and only the Norse gods are real, and real metaphysics is Norse metaphysics, but history is real history, why did they let the worship of them and the culture that believed in them die out? Why did they let that go away? Why did we end up in a world in which the religions that dominate everything are not the one that these entities appear in, if they're real? Which is a neat historical question. So the narrative does involve, events in mythological time and the death of Balder and other such things, but it also goes, the first chapter takes place in the year 1598. Long after the worship of the Norse gods is gone. But if they're real, they're still around, and Valhalla is still there, full of dead Vikings. The dead Vikings aren't gone, they're just dead. They're still around, right? How are they interacting with the world when Hamlet is debuting in the Globe in London? What do we do with Norse metaphysics and its compatibility with the real world? And one of the things that makes this an extra cool metaphysics to work with right now as we're trying to understand climate is the centrality of the precarity and vulnerability of the world. Right? Norse metaphysics is about survival being hard. It is hard for humans to survive. It is hard for gods to survive. It is hard for Yggdrasil to survive. It is hard for the world to survive. And lots of hard work and desperate action is necessary to enable survival. Even to make a world in which humans, something as fragile as humans, could live in the first place, required Odin to murder his own grandfather and make the world out of his corpse, right? And all of the living things are made out of rot, decay, and death. So, for example, you may have heard about the three races, elves, dwarves, and humans, which the gods made early in the world after they had killed Ymir, made his corpse into a world. Then they're going to make stuff. And our texts tell us that the elves they made out of the warm, playful, spiraling winds, the zephyrs that were rising up from the world. The dwarves they made out of the worms that were crawling through it, hence dwarves living in tunnels. And then humans they made out of trees. What this actually is the three stages of the decay of a corpse. The off-gassing of the bloat of the bacterial stage of decay, and then the maggots that appear in the corpse and start eating it, and then finally the plants that grow up once this has become habitable soil. The elves, dwarves, and humans are made out of the process of decay.
But we get the best part.
Yeah,
we get to be trees.
But it also means
we're not
we are
death
the least
part.
gross. We are the least gross, but we are the most fragile.
That is a fair point. Yeah.
And that is why the gods have to work really, really hard, a lot, and all the time to protect humans. And, a lot of the striving and terrible, terrible things that the gods have to do, including a lot of murder of their own first cousins and close kindred, is to carve out a space where humans can live. Because another thing that gets left out a lot is the fact that all of these people are racially mixed, right? Odin's mother is Jotun. That gets left out of things because Nazis didn't like mixed race being part of this mythology, so they made up the idea that we were wrong about where his mother came from, that the texts were garbled, and that she had a special origin. Nope, she's clearly a Jotun. We know her name, we know her father's name, we know her relatives. They're all Jotuns. All of these are, and almost all of Odin's children's mothers are also Jotuns. Heimdall is the exception. His mothers are 9 giantesses who are also a tree. So they're not Jotuns, but they're not just Jotuns. So all of this is about the interdependence of two peoples that are living near each other, intermarrying, but nonetheless can only survive through violence because of limited resources. And the desperate effort to try to preserve an unstable world against the increasingly chaotic encroachments of storm and flood and fire and climate crisis. So it's actually a really useful point of view for us to be revisiting in a moment in which one of our big problems as a culture is how dominated the world is by metaphysics which presume that the authority figures and gods and so on have power over nature, and that nature is not a problem, nature is just a tool, right? And it's set up like this. And there are wonderful books on the problem that people have with thinking through climate change, because if you think about Christianity's perspective, for example, there is a top-down plan. This was created for humans. Of course, it's never going to go wrong. It'll be fine. The idea that nature is so powerful and chaotic that even the makers of humanity had to compromise to try to make something that would desperately kind of work, but are constantly fighting back against forces of flood and flame. That's a worldview that actually may give us better tools for thinking about our civilization as in the embrace of a complicated and chaotic system in which we need to make compromises for survival. So I think it's a really great metaphysics to revisit in this moment for that reason. And I'm excited to be able to tell a story that I hope will open it up to people in a more approachable version than the $300 a volume Oxford University annotated Poetic Edda, which even if you had it, isn't a thrill a minute, I gotta say, unless you already know a lot of your stuff. So
this is probably a friendly reminder that if you have a library, abuse the crap out of it.
Yes. Interlibrary loan that sucker.
I do that all the time. My university library probably hates me or loves me because I will go in and I've interlibrary loaned 80 books. I know you're going to be dealing with it, but it's going to fit the backpack
librarians
somehow.
love that, right? Their job is to get you the books. If people want to take some dives into Norse myth right now, the 2 books that I highly recommend for getting to know more advanced stuff that you can get a hold of fairly easily, there's one called The Viking Way by Neil Price, who was actually one of the consultants on The Vikings, the show, and was one of the things that made it great. But it's really good on the metaphysics and zooms in on these questions of what is Yggdrasil, what are the threads of fate, what is the type of magic that interacts with them, how does Odin work? Odin is not a good, happy father figure god in any way. Odin is a terrifying god. His name literally means frenzy, in the sense of battle frenzy or berserk frenzy or frenzied trance. He's a very interesting, very sinister, very complex figure, not at all the watered down old version. So Neil Price's The Viking Way. There's also Caroline Larrington, who I really recommend her translation of the Poetic Edda. But she's got a green book that's, I think, called An Introduction to Northern Mythology or something like that, Caroline Larrington. And that's a really good starter one as well. It summarizes the stories, but in the way we want, which is the way that admits that we're missing 70% of everything and we just don't know. One of the problems with a lot of myth books is they want the stories to be tidy, and so they will leave out the, we don't know what this is. Whereas I often say that in Viking studies, you can answer any question about Norse mythology with one of 5 answers. 1, we don't know. 2, that was made up in the 19th century by kind of folklore people or Hans Christian Andersen or possibly the Brothers Grimm. 3, Snorri Sturluson made that up because he wanted it to alliterate. 4, Finland. 5, 25 pages of footnotes explaining incredibly meticulously why we don't know. Those are the 5 answers that can answer any question about Norse mythology.
Wow.
But it's in the transition from we don't know to here's 20 fascinating pages of notes on why we don't know that the real treat of scholarship is, and where the room for fun storytelling is.
Oh, your book sounds amazing and fascinating and possibly even important. And I certainly look forward to reading it in a couple of years.
Yes, my guess
is that I will
probably finish it this fall, which means it will probably be out in 2026.
Okay, great. Do you have anything shorter coming up in the meantime? Are you going to do any more podcasting with Joe Walton? What's coming up for you?
Yes, Joe and I were just discussing having a podcast about Godzilla. Joe has never watched any Godzilla, but discussing Godzilla as a craft question is very interesting. So we're going to be doing a little more podcasting. Joe and I also have an essay collection coming out at some point. It doesn't have a scheduled date at present, but it's a collection of our essays about the craft of writing and about science fiction and fantasy. The title is Trace Elements, Conversations on the Project of Science Fiction and Fantasy. It collects some of her already published essays, some of mine, and then some new ones, including what I think is a really great history of the genre, and some other cool stuff. So we've been working on that. The Inventing the Renaissance book is coming out in spring. What else am I working on? A couple of tedious academic scholarly things. I just had an article out about the use of perfect passive participles in the scholarship in Pomponioletto.
It's so specific.
We got to do that stuff.
Get on
too,
that,
man.
folks.
Anyone who wants that, email me because it's incredibly hard to find. But the 3 people who care loved that article. But, without articles like that, we would never have figured out that Heimdall is a tree. So you gotta build up these steps slowly.
You move up the steps, yeah.
I think those are the main things. I'm doing a scholarly article on Lucretius and Shakespeare.
Okay.
But mostly I've been trying to get the Norse myth stuff going. Save every inch of time I have for it. So.
Well, thank you so much for your time with us tonight. This has been a great conversation. I've really enjoyed talking with you.
This is so much. I have learned more things. I know Paul in chat has learned. I think Paul might actually be drunk now on information. So he might be drooling. It may or may not be coherent later tonight. Well,
yeah.
We got to wrap up, and so we'll let folks know at home. If you'd like to let us know what you thought about the episode, you have any questions, or you have a comment, or you want to suggest books to us that are related to many of the things that Ada has brought up today, skiffingfanty.com/listener suggestions, or you can go to email skiffingfanty@gmail.com. We're Skiffing Fanty on pretty much everywhere, but we have a link tree, which is linktr.ee/skiffingfanty, which is like all of our social media channels, newsletter, all of that good stuff. So you can find us many places. Obviously, if you like the show, patreon.com/skiffingfanty is one way you can support, but please leave reviews or tell your friends, or scream about us on a street corner, which does weirdly help. So there's that. And then as a reminder, we are here every Friday, typically every Friday at 7 p.m. Central for whatever it is we happen to be doing that night on Twitch, which is my Twitch, which is twitch.tv/alphabetstreams. And then that's where I'm at Tuesdays, Thursdays at 7. And then I'm got a bunch of stuff. My link tree is just Shaun Duke. You can find me on all the socials as well.
All right. Well, you can find me, Trish M, on Blue Sky at PE Matson, on Mastodon, newsy.social at TrishEM, and on my blog at whatsthewordnow.blogspot.com. And where can people find you, Ada?
You can find me at adapalmer.com, and also my blog is exurbe.com, EXURBE, which means from the city. It's how you would sign a letter when you're writing from Rome, because Rome is the city.
Oh.
And I blog intermittently about history, gelato, science fiction, various sorts of things. There's also my International Gelato Atlas. If you're anywhere in the world and need to find good gelato, it might have help for you, and has a guide to how to spot good gelato. Gelato is a very serious issue for anyone who studies Italy. And then I do a podcast with Joe Walton called Ex Urbe ad Astra, so from the city to the stars, where we talk about a variety of topics, but especially sort of 202 level advanced craft of writing things. We had one on chapters and chapter titles a little while ago. We had one on invented profanity at one point, which was fun too. So anyone who enjoys nitty-gritty detailed craft discussions with me and Joe. And then my books are anywhere books are, and Inventing the Renaissance comes out early 2025. You can also see essays of mine. I'm a columnist for Strange Horizons. So if you pop in there, you'll see some more of my essay writing, which is part of why I'm not blogging on Exurbe as often, just because my essay produce is mostly going to Strange Horizons, because they're such a great magazine. So I love to have their stuff. I did a piece on the history of science fiction and censorship, so as a sample topic. And music is also linked through adapalmer.com. You can get, the group is called Sassafras. You can download the Norse Myth a cappella song cycle from Bandcamp.
All right, as required by the Skiffing Fanty bylaws, I have to make it awkward now. And that is that Ada's going to disagree, but I have done the deep research on this, and the Blood Eagle was in fact a cocktail. And all of the sources that claim it was like a thing where they tortured a guy and pulled his lungs out or whatever. No. It was a cocktail. It was made with Bloody Mary mix, rum, and any other liquor that was available. You just put all that in there, and that's what it was, Blood Eagle. I'll leave it at that. On that note, awkward ending and scene.
Take care of yourselves and each other.